Hi, my name is Serrina Ruggles. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her, and I'm the Center Coordinator for the Gala Pride and Diversity Center and the President of the Board for the Central Coast Kink Community. Just a brief disclaimer, this talk does not contain any explicit conversation around specific kink or sexual practices. However, it does acknowledge the existence of sexuality, BDSM, kink, and refers to other adult conversations around sexuality and relationships. Viewer discretion is advised. So, welcome to the Kinky Activist. From the outside perspective, kink and social justice don't seem to go hand in hand. And if most of your interactions with kink come from the mainstream media, it would be understandable for you to view kink as one of the ways in which we support these systems of oppression. However, what we see in shows like 50 Shades of Grey or that new Netflix show Bonding are really inaccurate from what is actually practiced by kinky individuals. Individuals in kink are statistically less likely to prescribe to harmful myths around rape, are more likely to be more accepting of gender diversity, and the leather BDSM community has a long history of social justice and community activism. And you can read much more about the history of the LGBTQ leather community in this month's issue of the Gala Pride and Diversity Center newsletter. So what are these terms that I'm talking about? BDSM and kink and leather. So BDSM is actually a collection of acronyms. It could perhaps be more accurately called BDDSSM, but nobody has time for that. So the B and the D stand for bondage and discipline. D and S stands for dominance and submission. And S and M stands for sadism and masochism. This deals with the negotiated exchange of power and sensation between consenting adults. Kink is an umbrella term. And kink encompasses BDSM as well as fetishism, role-playing, and all other kinds of non-conventional sexual concepts, practices, or fantasies. And leather, as it is used here, refers to the subculture that has grown out of kink communities. It is particularly associated with the LGBTQ+ leather communities that established the first kink groups in the 40s and 50s. These groups established much of what we see today in terms of kink practices and culture. Now, these concepts that I'm talking about, especially around BDSM and kink, may sound shocking, but the reality is they can mean wildly different things to different people. BDSM can be playful and loving just as easily as it can be dark and serious. Sadomasochism can use feathers and pillow talk just as much as it can use whips and chains. And asexual people have found that the BDSM community can provide a welcoming space for them to seek connection without the assumption of sexual contact. At its heart, kink is most often about facilitating connection between partners and facilitating self-understanding. In kink communities, you'll probably find reference to one of these three acronyms. We have RAC, Risk-Aware Consensual Kink, PRIC, Personal Responsibility in Consensual Kink, and SSC, Safe, Sane, Consensual. And you can find thousands of essays on the subtle differences between these acronyms, and that's far outside the scope of this talk. But essentially, all three of these acronyms identify two core truths to BDSM. And that is, first of all, that consent is the key to everything that we do in BDSM. And secondly, that there's risk associated with any kink activities, and it is the responsibility of anybody involved to do their own research, be aware of what those risks are, how to mitigate them, how to respond to emergency, and how to talk to their partners about those risks. And these risk-aware decisions are decisions that we're all making in our everyday lives. Getting into your car and driving to work is a risk-aware decision. Making large purchases, going skydiving, going to the grocery store during the COVID pandemic are all risk-aware choices that we are making in our everyday lives. Now, let's go back to consent. Consent is key to everything that we do in BDSM. And in the local kink community, the way that we teach consent is that consent must be active, informed, sober, non-coerced, and continuous. So this means, of course, we're going to be talking about what exactly everybody will be doing, but we're also going to be talking about things like intention. Is this scene going to be sexual? Is it going to be sensual? Is it going to be asexual? And what does that mean to all the participants? We're going to talk about how we're going to take care of each other afterwards, how we are going to actively communicate our continuous consent throughout the experience, and how we're going to keep each other safe. Negotiating a single type of activity can take anywhere from a few minutes to a few weeks, and negotiating a power exchange relationship can take months, and it's often a negotiation that is ongoing throughout the life of the relationship. And another thing that we teach about consent in our community is that learning how to advocate for your own boundaries, needs, and desires is an ongoing process. Because in our culture, we are taught from day one to downplay our needs, set aside our desires, and be flexible with our boundaries, especially if we're part of a marginalized community. Think of how often we see salary workers being asked to stay overtime because they want to be a team player or that's what their boss is doing, or how often people in marginalized groups are asked by HR if they're really sure that that microaggression was really that very nice coworker's intention. And this is even getting into how cases of sexual violence are handled in the justice system and in the court of public opinion. Now let's talk about sober consent. By now, we've all heard the good word, drunk people cannot consent. And that's absolutely true, but in kink communities, we take it a step further, and we actually consider kink to be a type of inebriant. In conversations around vanilla sex, you might hear people reference the point of no return. That moment when you're so caught up in what's going on that you might not be thinking clearly anymore. And in kink communities, we not only explicitly recognize that as a not sober space, we recognize that we may not always be able to tell when we cross that line. So once we start doing what we've negotiated we're going to do, we don't add on to those negotiations. And this is one of the many ways in which kinksters work to identify barriers to high quality consent practices. And this includes evaluating how negotiated and non-negotiated power differentials might affect our ability to communicate consent. So let's talk about power exchange. How does entering a consensual, negotiated power dynamic affect our understanding of consent and power in the rest of our lives? First, let's acknowledge that there are power dynamics within all human relationships. Some of these dynamics are explicitly acknowledged, like the relationship between an employee and a manager, but some dynamics go unacknowledged, like power dynamics in friend groups, or power dynamics between two people in a relationship. Power exchange dynamics that are consensual seek to acknowledge and codify these differences of power and recognize, negotiate, and adjust any of those differences to be equitable, if not necessarily equal. Furthermore, these structures provide a way for us to actively communicate our ongoing consent. The easiest way to describe these power differentials, this is best described by the feminist theory of power over versus power with. In the power over model, power is relative and hierarchical. You always have more or less power than the person next to you, and the goal is to ascend within that hierarchy of power. And the only way that you can gain power is by taking it away from somebody else. People who operate under the power over model will often respond to calls for equality as if they are personal threats, because people who operate under this model cannot imagine a world in which empowering another person does not personally detract from their power. The power over structure is supported by fear, threats, retaliation, and violence. Now, on the inverse side, we have the power with model, and which is based on collaboration and relationships. Power with is supported by respect, mutual empowerment, solidarity, and collaboration. This is the model most often implemented in consensual power exchange dynamics. Again, even though it might not be obvious from the outside, these dynamics seek to codify how the participants are going to empower each other and grow together. Now, we are seeing more conversations around things like the uneven distribution of emotional labor or household management. But it's important to understand that much of these issues stem from the fact that these dynamics often go unrecognized and therefore non-negotiated. And it's also important to ask, why these dynamics go non-recognized, and how they are built to be hidden within this power over structure. Stepping into this power with model in our relationships, where every aspect is negotiated, from household management to how we interact with each other, can be a really eye-opening moment, where we're forced to confront how we're operating in this power over structure in so many other aspects of our lives. It can force us to recognize where those power differentials may be not recognized, and furthermore are exploited for the benefit or detriment of others. And this can be a moment where people who have been involved in social justice before they got involved in kink find their views changing and radicalizing because of their experiences in kink. I've known more than one women and gender studies major who reported that getting involved with kink made it easier for them to recognize and speak out against these unrecognized, non-negotiated differences in power. A crucial part of this process is self-examination. Eventually, anybody who participates in kink often enough and long enough will ask themselves, why? And it's a big question with a lot of moving parts. But one of the important aspects to consider is how our culture has influenced our relationship with our sexuality. And every identity has its own set of considerations to think about. Race, gender, sexual orientation, cultural background, personal history, all have their own set of expectations, assumptions, and prejudices to unpack around our sexual expression. The most well-explored version of this question is the question of the submissive woman. Can a woman who chooses to be submissive, particularly in a relationship with a man, truly be empowered? This was the question at the forefront of a series of debate at feminist conferences throughout the 80s and 90s. And this question was so hotly debated that this series of academic debates is now referred to as the feminist sex wars. So in the feminist sex wars, one group essentially argued that women could not genuinely consent to BDSM due to their conditioning within a patriarchal society. Furthermore, women who did genuinely consent were inherently anti-feminist and anti-woman for further enforcing the ideals of male superiority and female submission. The other group argued that women are perfectly capable of contextualizing their own experiences and are not responsible for the ways that people outside of their relationship view their personal choices. They saw this debate as not eliminating gender-based expectations, so much as moving the goalposts to control female sexuality under a different narrative. Essentially, they argue that women are perfectly capable of thinking critically about their own lives and are the only experts on their own lived experiences. Now, this debate continues to this day, but it's becoming harder and harder to argue with the research. As more high-quality research around kink practitioners begins to emerge, we see that many of our prejudiced assumptions around kink practitioners, especially around our social and political beliefs, are flat out wrong. But it's still a good question. There are plenty of bad actors who use kink to hide or excuse abuse, and many of those mainstream representations of kink, which again are wholly inaccurate and are frankly downright offensive, often romanticize abuse and enforce ideals of white supremacy. Examining how one's culture has impacted their relationship with kink does a few crucial things. First off, it's a protective factor that allows us to better identify predatory behaviors. Secondly, it allows us to challenge our own assumptions about the way that we interact with our sexuality. I've known several women who come into the community assuming that they are submissive, only to go through a process like this and come out the other side understanding that actually, they're more interested in dominance. Anybody who goes through kink can have this experience and go through this exploration, and there are different considerations for every identity. But this exploration of how our culture has impacted us is crucial for the next step of the process. One of the most beautiful and least talked about aspects of kink is the capacity for growing self-understanding. When we have these conversations with ourselves, it's not something with an endpoint. And kink has a way of pushing us to explore the parts of ourselves that we hide out of shame or fear or guilt. And how we contribute to the structures of oppression around us is part of that process. It's easy to get stuck in examining how our culture has impacted us, but it doesn't really do much if we don't follow that up with asking how we contribute to that society in return. At some point, we all have to ask ourselves, when have I violated consent? When have I had more power than the person next to me and used that to my advantage? When have I used that to their disadvantage? When have I seen somebody be flexible with their boundaries and exploited that to make my life easier without even intending to? Well, what now? This is the turning point. It's easy to say, it's all too much. There's nothing that I can do as an individual. It's enough to just know what's right. But there's something special that can happen when we practice kink, because we are forced to continuously confront those parts of ourselves that we are ashamed of, that we feel fear of. And when we have that process continually happening, the call to action is not far behind. We respond with activism. We respond by banding together with drag queens and transgender people to establish the first grassroots organization to provide relief funding to victims of the AIDS crisis. We respond by helping to found the Mattachine Society, the first gay liberation activist group. We respond with Folsom Street Fair to raise awareness of gentrification in San Francisco's Soma neighborhood and to raise funds for victims of the AIDS crisis. This is the largest outdoor fetish festival in the world, and it continues to this day with new nonprofit community partners every year. And we respond like Brenda Howard, who helped to plan the first Gay Pride Week on the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And social justice and community activism continue to core core values in the leather community to this day. We have local, state, regional, national, and international competitions with all kinds of categories of entry, where competitors are evaluated in part on how they have given back to their community. And new organizations continue to emerge, like the Kinky Activist Support Fund organization, which emerged after the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. And smaller communities like our Central Coast Kink community, which hosts a biannual fundraiser, continue to anonymously donate raised funds. Kink is about connection and self-exploration. These radical ideas of consent and power counter everything we've been taught about who we are and what is expected of us. Now, this process isn't exclusive to kink, but it does provide us an excellent framework to better understand the complexities of power. It pushes us to be vulnerable and to explore that vulnerability. And that can be a powerful method of awakening.